Okay, all right, I think we have like one person in the room, so we can let them hear. Okay, and I'll just quickly for a good Zoom measure, make the mention that this is being recorded, so anybody attending in the Zoom as an audience member today, if you could just stay off camera and stay muted so that you don't accidentally get recorded as part of this. There will be a chance to submit questions at the end of the panel via the chat function once we've gone through the sort of planned questions, but that's the part for the Zoom, and I'm gonna turn this over to Taylor.
All right, hi everyone. I'm so excited to be here kicking off the Behind the Mic series for CFRU. This is a series where we learn about different interview styles from experienced voices on airwaves, and it is running until November 15th. We have a few different panelists here with us today, so I'm just going to introduce them from left to right. So first we have Amara and Sophia. They are the hosts of CFRU Live along with 8 other individuals. They do interviews and in-studio performances and host a space for local artists to express themselves. CFRU Live can be listened to on Tuesdays at 12 on CFRU. Next, we have Tristan Curtis, who hosts Tales from the Bridge. And this is a show where there are discussions with different storytellers, authors, and filmmakers. Tales from the Bridge can be listened to on Thursdays at 9 a.m. on CFRU. Next, we have Jenny Mitchell, who is the mobile studio coordinator. She is our voice for underrepresented voices today, and she hosts Bridging the Social Distance, which airs on Thursdays and Fridays at noon on CFRU. Next, we have Adam Donaldson, who is the host of Open Sources, the political show on CFRU. He's also a City Hall columnist for GuelphToday.com and a writer for Guelph Politico. Open Sources airs on Thursdays at 5 on CFRU. Next, we have Mike, who is the host of This Week in Geek. It's one of the longest podcasts running in Canada, and it's been on air since 2007. You can listen to the podcast on thisweekingeek.net. And then joining us on Zoom, we have Amorwa, who is one of the co-hosts of Radio Operg, which focuses on activism and transformative justice. And you can listen to that on Thursdays at 3 p.m. on CFRU. So panelists, thank you so much for joining us today. Looking forward to getting into the discussion. So I'm going to kick things off just with a very basic question, and I'd like to keep it as brief as possible if we can. So I'm going to go left to right again for this one. And can you briefly tell us about your show, what types of topics you cover, and what sort of guests you might interview for your show?
Okay. So CFRU Live, kind of like you mentioned earlier, Taylor, we bring in local musicians from around Southern Ontario, but also from BC sometimes.
And the US sometimes.
And the US sometimes. We bring them on for our live show in CFRU's Vinyl Library, where us and our 6 other co-producers do all the production, setup, and promotion, and Sophia and I do the interviews. Yep. And that's CFRU Live. That's our show.
So at Tales from the Bridge, we're a podcast, and then we are on Thursday mornings at 9 a.m. with CFRU. We are a book club of science fiction. We're a film club as well. And then mostly we are interviewing authors and filmmakers and actors. So we've always got new guests on the show, and yeah, happy to speak about interviewing today.
I'm Jenny. So currently for CFRU, I host Bridging the Social Distance, which airs on Thursdays and Fridays at noon. And prior to that, it was the Mobile Community Radio Show. And so I produced both of those as CFRU's Mobile Studio Coordinator. So it's basically mobile radio, I sort of define as any of the radio content that we collect from people outside of our physical station. But then in terms of the projects that I coordinate or who I choose as guests and who ends up on the show, it's usually me trying to think of people that might be left out. It might just be folks I haven't heard from or seen up at the station in a bit, or it might be that I have reasons to suspect that they might have some other barriers to coming up. So I'd say the overwhelming majority of what you'll hear on Bridging the Social Distance, that one came about in the pandemic and has continued since, but a lot of seniors, a lot of going to retirement residences, so lots of older folks on that show, but you'll also catch school-age children and a mix of other characters as well.
Open Sources Guelph is a long-running political and news show on CFRU, and to obviously to go with that, our guests frequently include city councilors, MPPs, MPs, so members of provincial parliament, members of parliament. So that means like Mike Schreiner, Lloyd Longfield. We also have activists on and people trying to raise awareness of issues, area experts. To give you some example, in terms of recent examples, we've had the Unifor national organizer who got the Mississauga Walmart warehouse organized and unionized. We've talked to Norm Di Pasquale, who's the head of the group Ontario Place for All. We've had Elise Lamb on the show, who is a writer for Canadian Architect magazine and kind of a citizen expert on the architecture of Ontario Place. And it's mostly long form interviews delving into topical matters with people and politicians in the know.
Hi, so yeah, it's Mike Ashby, This Week in Geek. This Week in Geek tends to talk to pretty much anybody. I've talked with like scientists, I've talked with movie stars, authors, I've talked with people from the adult industry as well. And the gag there was talk about everything but sex. And that's kind of the big fun thing there, because a lot of people don't like, everybody, talks with those type of people and they're like, oh, hey, what's the weirdest thing you've ever done? I'm like, no, I want to know what's your favorite color. And I want to know what's your favorite book, that sort of thing. So I love to have fun with my guests. And we've had people who have been NASA scientists. We've had FBI agents on the show. We've had people who've been on Star Trek. We've had just all sorts of people on there. And I'd say some of the more interesting people we have are like voice actors, like people who work in anime, stuff like that. People work in video games, and it's always very spur of the moment, very fun interviews. Basically, whenever I get the press emails from people like, hey, do you want to talk to this person? If there's a conversation there, I'll probably do it. So we just like to have fun on This Week in Geek. We talk about pretty much anything and everything, and if it's interesting and fun, I'll find a way to make it exciting for you as well.
Hey folks, I'm Marla here. So on Radio Perg, which airs on Thursdays 3 to 4, we typically interview anyone and anybody related to social and environmental justice. I do tend to keep it as local as I can, so we do focus on grassroots organizations, people who are doing really, really cool work in the community, who want to raise awareness about stuff. So think orgs like your Downtown Guelph Friends, Justice for Workers, the Guelph Tool Library. We've done quite a few interviews with them. And then we also do some recorded talks from events that we've either put on or have attended. So stuff like Grassy Narrows and stuff from our Summer of Scheming series.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. For this next question, I'm going to go down the panel the other way. So we'll start with Amorwa and then go to Mike, Adam, etc. So how do you guys find people to interview, and how do you connect with them to arrange your interviews?
So for me, I would have to say that like throughout the years, I've just started developing a really good relationship with some of the organizers in town. I've just been going to their events, showing up in solidarity for whatever their issues are, and just have the opportunity to talk with them and relate with them and help them get aware, like their awareness out essentially. I am also a fan of cold like emails and calls, just being like, hey, I heard you have this event coming up. Typically, our newsletter is kind of connected, so we like to showcase really awesome things that are happening in the community. And I always offer an opportunity to like come on a radio show and tell people about it. So my approach has typically been like time sensitive events that are coming up, but like really cool events that people should know about and care about.
I'd say for me, on This Week in Geek, we get a lot of emails like, hey, we have this new game coming out. There's a new movie. Sometimes people will offer us things like that. And I'm like, okay, cool. Can we talk to so-and-so from it? But if it comes to like a product or something, say there's a new Dungeons and Dragons book, I'm like, hey, can I talk to the author? Can I talk to the game designer, the line editor, stuff like that? So I will just follow up with people. When I was a journalist with the Guelph Mercury Tribune, I would just cold call people and just say, hey, I need a quote from you. Do you have a couple minutes? And 9 times out of 10, that was fairly effective. For me, I'm fairly assertive when I want an interview. Basically, you're going to talk to me. It's just a matter of when. Yeah, I mean, I haven't been rebuked too often for interviews. More often than not, I've got a pretty good rep in the industry. I found one of the things I've been fostering over the years, since 2007, is be super friendly, be super approachable. But because sometimes I need content, and it's just people will 9 times out of 10 they'll come on the show to talk for 5 or 15 minutes. But I've also had interviews that began as 30 minutes, they ended up being over 2.5 hours, just because they ended up just being so much fun. We just kind of chit chatted, and it was kind of awesome. So that is how that works.
Yeah, kind of the same for me. If it's a specific topic like Ontario Place or the Science Center or there's usually someone specific to talk to. I get a lot of press releases, and when you get a press release, there's usually a media contact who can then refer you to who to talk to and when their availability is. On open sources, we have like a rotating cast of people that we talk to. So like obviously we try to get the city councilors in at least once a year. There's 12 of them, so that's 12 weeks right there. Our MP or MPP or regular guests, and so we also kind of have this stable of people that I literally have a page in my notebook which is like the list of like the same 15 people, and I highlight them off every time they're on the show and work down that list until the list is done, and then we start again.
So I have a few different approaches with the mobile community radio show. Often I would set up our mobile studio in a neighborhood group space. So there I would actually have a physical manifestation of our gear. Usually I would meet with the Neighborhood Support Coalition ahead of time to identify a neighborhood that might be receptive to it and make sure that conversations happened in advance of me bringing gear in so that they knew it was there. They knew the context for it. They knew I would never be like randomly recording, but that there'd always be kind of consent in that. And then also usually picking things like coffee hours or social times where it would be possible to sort of have a conversation on the side or like away from things where there wouldn't be like a lot of high stress. So there might be like a lot of high volume, say, when they're coming to pick up like their food share, but then they might also not be able to stick around and have other things on the go. So it's usually a balancing act of like, where are there people who might be comfortable chatting with me without knowing me. Usually I had to, go first and have coffee and sit down and become a community member for a bit before ever getting the microphones out or hitting record. So there's usually, for me, some amount of kind of like putting myself in the space and getting to know folks before any of that kind of interaction happens. And then with retirement centers, a really big thing that like why you hear so many seniors' voices, I specifically go to the village of Riverside Glen these days, and it's because there's a manager there who has proven to be very, very thoughtful with his interaction with residents, and it really picked up during the pandemic. There were stretches where me on a Zoom call for our radio show were the only visitors allowed in the building because physical visitors can come in. So having him there where he knew who the residents were, who might be having a good day or a bad day, and just kind of chatting with them ahead of time to make sure that I'm coming on a day that they're comfortable. I think that's the prep work that's really necessary for me finding guests. It's proven really great to talk to somebody trustworthy who's authentically in a space, and then learn how I can kind of show up and be part of that too. So I'd say that's sort of where I have mostly found my guests. And in schools, the only difference, I often don't end up interviewing the school children. I teach them to interview each other. So they're not as guests as often, I guess, for that.
Excuse me. We have a few different ways of tracking down guests that may want to join us on the show. When we first started in 2021, we were going for, we were a book club to start, so we were going for authors of science fiction books. So authors are pretty easy to get because they want to talk. They want to talk about their books. So most of them have their own website, so you could just reach out to the author, and most of the time they're happy to talk. They want to talk about their books. They want to sell their books. So that's how we kind of started off. We ended up getting an interview with a filmmaker named Neil Blomkamp pretty early because he was working with one of the authors that we spoke to. So that was kind of just like a network that just kind of happened. It was a neat connection. So that's something that does happen often. And then when it comes to other filmmakers and then actors, there are professional, I guess, industry websites that you can use, in which imdb.com, imdbpro.com is one in particular, in which you can get contact with actors and filmmakers, managers, and publicists. And for the most part, if you're talking to people from Hollywood and those places, they're pretty good at replying pretty quickly, whether they want to join you or not. I end up, when it comes to reaching out to people from Hollywood, I will send out 50 to 80 emails before I hear maybe 2 or 3 that actually do want to come on the show. I'll still get about 30 or 40 of polite no's, which is really nice, because if you talk to people from Toronto or Vancouver, I don't know what it is, but they often just don't even reply. They I don't know what is going on with that, but down in the States, they're pretty good at politely saying no, or you hit some for every few dozen that you send out. But for the most part, people that have their own websites and screenwriters and people that want to be on the show, they're usually pretty easy to get in touch with. And then sometimes you just meet people in life. We're talking to someone this week that's from Kitchener-Waterloo area, and they're a board game designer, so it just kind of happened because we knew people. So all different kinds of ways of getting in contact with people.
Yeah, so the story of how CFRU has gone about, CFRU Live has gone about getting guests to interview has been kind of a journey. So it started out with us, our teammate Katie, who was working in the music department on the Playing in Guelph playlist folder. She would kind of see what local artists were coming to town and who would maybe be willing to pass through the station to visit us in the vinyl library and maybe be willing to talk to us as well. And from our first broadcast, which was with Animal Boy, who was a band from Guelph, we grew our social media presence, and through that as well, we were able to connect with more local talent through word of mouth and social media, and also going to shows, going to so many shows, like 2-3 shows a week. We'd go and stick around after for a long time, just chatting with the bands and the artists, like opening acts and the main artists, just asking if they wanted to come on the show. And we'd take down emails and numbers, and eventually we grew a pretty big contact list. And after we pretty much had everyone that we collected in person on the show, we started being reached out to through our social media. And now we get an overwhelming amount of emails of like local and beyond artists asking to come and visit us. And it's really amazing and awesome and kind of surreal.
Cool. So you kind of briefly touched on my next question in your answer there. So like who do you prioritize when people are reaching out to you?
That's a great
And then
question.
for the other panelists, do you guys have people reaching out to you as well?
Yeah, so we aim to prioritize FemCon, other marginalized groups, BIPOC, and queer content, where as much as we can. And yeah, that's our overarching goal, is to give a voice to those who wouldn't usually get the opportunity to, I don't know, play on the radio. And it's been really cool. We've been exposed to lots of different types of music through prioritizing those who don't always get to be heard.
Yeah, we get a lot of emails from people who want to write a book and want to be on the show, and they haven't written a book yet. That happens all the time. We do get, we've got a great relationship with a few publishers like Tor.com and Orbit, and they reach out all the time to have guests on our show. We have to be picky with who's on the show just because we are bi-weekly. We release episodes bi-weekly. And this is a hobby for us, so we don't really, I mean, we could do 2 or 3 interviews a week if we were doing what the publicists wanted or the publishers wanted. But we're a little bit more picky. We want to talk to people that we want to talk to on the show. Maybe we'll expand out, but a lot of people, there are companies that do reach out that get paid by filmmakers, actors, like they'll pay to have someone reach out to get their work out there. So we do get those all the time. Sometimes if it works for for a schedule or what we've been talking about on the show lately, we will have them on the show, and it just depends. But yeah, people are reaching out. Everyone wants to be on a podcast lately, I'm sure.
I would say that I get people reaching out sometimes who want to be interviewed just generally. And because I also wear the hat of being CFRU's volunteer coordinator and being a staff member, I would say the overwhelming amount of asks that come in, that if they are like a musician, an author, somebody doing something in the community, if it's political in nature, wherever possible, I go to our programming director, Christopher, and say, like, try and find one of our other programmers first, because it's going to be like probably more likely people would be listening to their show for those guests. So not only would they possibly be in a better or more suitable or more experienced position to receive those guests, but also their listeners are listening for that stuff. And so where possible, I want those opportunities to go to our other programmers. But certainly if there's nobody to cover it, and I think that it deserves representation, and if it's an underrepresented voice or topic, I will 100% take it on if no one else will. And if I, respect and care about the person and the cause. What I really like with the seniors that sort of naturally unfolded was often I'm talking to residents who are not participating in a lot of programming, or they might be new to the space, or they don't get a lot of visitors. So there's some exceptions to that, but I do find that while that's very careful to navigate, I have a good track record now, having gone to Riverside Glen for like 8 years or something. They trust me to be able to talk to people who are a bit resistant and maybe get them to open up, but like on their terms. And so that's where I really focus my energy, is like, I feel like I've developed a really specific skill set of engaging the cautious and nervous, and people who have like very real reasons to be nervous and cautious, and to get them to open up. But it's really helpful. Again, I kind of spoke to it with the earlier question, but when I can trust that someone else in that space has a bit of that information and context for me. But certainly during the pandemic, when we were focusing on people moving in, they were moving into like 2-week lockdowns where they couldn't see anybody else. So speaking to them early on gave them a sense of being connected to the retirement center as a whole. So I really appreciated my role in having them feel connected to a bigger community when they really couldn't physically or visually see that. So that's where I'm going to focus my energy, I guess. And if I get asks beyond that, try to sort of move those along to other folks where possible.
Yeah, it's a mix of things. I will say right now, like this time of year, there's a lot of stuff going on around the city of Guelph budget renewal. So we're going to have city councilors on over the next couple of weeks to talk about the challenges they're in. So that there's like that very specific opportunity. Something, sometimes someone will reach out to you who is a politician and like, I've got this new initiative that we're launching and we'd like to get it some airplay. And I mean, and that's, you kind of walk a fine line between wanting to make the community aware of something that one of their politicians is doing, but you also don't want to make it shameless self-promotion for the politician as well. But it is important, like if it's a complex issue, to sort of lay out the justification of it. So I do often find those valuable. To what Jenny said, sometimes opportunities come to you through the station, and there have been times when cabinet ministers, federal cabinet ministers have been rolling through town and they hit everybody, like they hit the media in the area. Interestingly, one recent example, they got in touch with Christopher about doing an interview with Democracy Now! I guess somebody scanned the CFRU website to find a news soundy show and landed on Democracy Now!, which CFRU, of course, syndicates through a national syndicated show. So CFRU just broadcasts. So Amy Goodman does not volunteer at CFRU. But yeah, a lot of it is just timeliness. And, for example, on my podcast, if it's like the 200th or 300th episode, I try to make it a special occasion. Interesting, the Riverside Glen connection for the 200th episode of the Politicast. I mailed a letter to Mayor Norm Jerry, who was the mayor of Guelph in the 70s and the 80s. Because
on my show.
Yeah, because he has no socials, he has no email, he has no MySpace or any even defunct social media. So I literally dropped a letter in the mail, and he phoned me after he got the letter. So, I mean, a little bit of effort, but that went a long way because that was a really great interview.
For me, a lot of stuff comes to us. We find we get a lot of people who want to talk about TTRPG Kickstarters. That's the tabletop role-playing game. Like I said, we get a lot of press emails and stuff like that. I tend to pursue a lot of my guests. Basically, if it's something that I want to talk about, like if I want to create content for my show, I want to be engaged. And I like to talk to other writers and other people that are in the creative industry, or if I see someone on social media who just happens to look interesting. Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes I'll talk with people from the adult industry because sometimes I find out they have like a really nerdy hobby, stuff like that. Like one person I interviewed early on was like, she was a contract girl for one of the largest adult companies, but turns out she was like a huge film dork. So we talked about like Quentin Tarantino for like 2 hours. And that was like a lot of fun. And then another one I found out is like a huge gamer. Another one was like a brony who was like a My Little Pony fanatic. And we talked about like Twilight Sparkle and stuff like that. And that was ridiculously fun and stupid. But yeah, I mean, other times I will look for just people that are pique my science interest. Like I have a big interest in space weather. Like I want to know more about what's going on with like solar flares. How does this particular space project work with this, that, and the other thing? Or if there's a particular topic in environmentalism, I'll take a kind of look at it. So it's usually me scouring websites. I mean, I do have a contact with the Canadian Space Agency, but trying to get a hold of any of the astronauts is always a bit of a trick. So.
Oh, these are amazing answers. So for me, I would say I do get a few asks here and there. It's usually dependent on who's had a relationship or has been on the show before. So typically, if they have something they would like to promote, I'm more than welcome to have them on the show. But I do a lot of the pursuing, and so do my volunteers whenever they get the chance based on their interests. So I've had some volunteers who were really curious about queer justice, and just being able to like understand what's going on in the community. So they've been able to attend a couple of vigils, a couple of demonstrations, and benefits and fundraisers. So for myself, I also keep like a giant like social justice calendar almost. So like anytime there are particular days of significance, I like to make sure that I have some content lined up for that and reaching out to the necessary organizations and groups to see if they would be interested in showcasing whatever they are planning to do. And typically it's a yes. But yeah, I really enjoy doing all of that. And then on top of all of it as well, I think OPERG also has like action groups, people who are doing cool stuff as volunteers. So I like to spend some time with them and make sure that people know what they're up to as well.
So just like really quickly, I just want to get an idea and go down the line and just find out who does shows live on air and who pre-records them first. Yeah, sure. Raise your hands if it's live. All right, Sophia and Amara, Mike.
I have done it, but not lately.
Adam's done it live. All right, and then the rest are pre-records.
Yeah, Moro is doing this.
Yeah, I have a couple of times where I do live, but I'm a Zoom girly. Sorry.
So for those whose interviews are live, how do you kind of keep a guest focused and manage and make sure they don't go off the rails, but also make sure they're still following general broadcasting rules, like not using offensive language on air?
These folks first.
Sure.
Yeah, it's kind of it's tough to say because I think that like I purposefully try to keep the interview style like a little bit messy and unpredictable. And I'm sure this will come up later as well, but my goal behind interviewing, especially because we're interviewing artists, is always to give people an idea of who the person is that is making the art. Like, I don't necessarily want to talk about like, oh, tell us about your first, what does your band name mean or whatever, like the last band we had on, and we talked about road trips. And so for me, like when it goes off the rails and we get into these like really weird niche conversations, the hypotheticals, yeah, I took a sharp left turn after Apollo's Sons, like one of the first bands we had, and I just like, anyways, I love asking hypotheticals to bands, so
It's a bit now.
it's a bit, and it's fun, and I'm actually running out, so if you have any suggestions and you want to leave them in, I'm just kidding. But anyways, yeah, so I think for me, like, that's kind of the point, is that people go a little bit off the rails, because again, like I want like people who are listening just to like enjoy the conversation that we're having. And to me, an enjoyable conversation is one where like people are talking about what they want to talk about. And if that's like, where you'd put your third arm, I would love to know. I have had a couple times where like, I'm like, okay, you can't say that. Put a quarter in the swear jar. But generally we don't have a problem with it. We do like a really quick briefing on musicians before they jump into the vinyl library, and they jump into sound check. So I'm always like, okay, yap as much as you want, but please don't say the F word. And
Here are the conditions.
here are the conditions. Like, I'm begging you, our show is kind of like predicated on you not screwing this up. And also really quickly before I pass it off to Soph, I want to say that a couple of our other co-producers are here. Olivier and Exodus and Ricky are here, and I'm very glad that you're here, and I love you, and that's all.
Yes, it's great. It's great to have more of the team here. But yeah, Amara and I kind of have a bit of a different interviewing style and like way that we direct things. Usually when we're duoing something, I'll let Amara take the lead because they are really good at that. And I'll just give my 2 cents where I feel is appropriate. But when I'm doing an interview solo, I like to get into some of the more like, what makes you want to make art, and like what sparks joy about being in this industry kind of questions, because as an artist myself and as someone who is in school for music, it's kind of nice to get like a feel for the artist's personalities, but also like a realistic view of what it's like to be dedicating so much of your life to being in music and pursuing it as a way of life. So yeah, we have a bit of a different approach, but when we come together, it's fun.
Yeah, if I could say one more thing on that point as well, I think we both kind of come from an interesting spot as interviewers for CFRU Live, because there wasn't like already an audience for what we do. Like, there are people who want to know about politics, who are really invested in Star Trek, who are, they have interest in media, or, whatever it may be, or like, yeah, social issues that are and environmental issues that are going on in Guelph. But like, we didn't really start this with an audience in mind. And so when we're, at least for me, when I'm thinking about interviewing, like I don't have to think about what other people want because it's like, it's never.
What do we want to talk to these guys about?
Yeah, it's never been like a solid part of the equation that it's like, okay, maybe we should take this in a direction where like, we're asking questions that other people want to know the answers to. We're just
We
kind
don't
of,
usually have an agenda in mind.
no, we're kind of allowed to like ask whatever we want. So-
And that's the beauty of it. for
and
us.
that is the beauty of it.
Cool. Awesome. I'm going to hand things over to Mike, and then if Adam and Amora have anything to say about doing live interviews, they can chime in as well.
I'd say for me, when it comes to live interviews, I tend to feel the person out. If it's in person, I can watch their body language, stuff like that. I can read the intonations in their voice, watch their eyes, stuff like that. If it's a pure audio interview, you have to kind of almost like use a psychic kind of way, like to read someone's body. Like you'll know someone's personality pretty quickly talking with them within about 2 or 3 minutes. And then to keep them on task, you have to listen to the response in the moment, and then you can steer the conversation. It's very much like trying to steer, I don't know, I guess a bumper car. I'm more or less, you're like, okay, I can go down this way, I can go down that way, I don't like the way they're going here, can I bring them back? And it's all about, again, you just have to be reacting in the moment. You have to be so adaptable, so on your feet, to make sure that the conversation goes the way that you want. And much like you guys do with your show, be in that moment, be present, go into the hypotheticals, because you'll get them, but you'll get the best conversations when they feel authentic and genuine. If you go too prepared, you can go to CBC for that kind of stuff. But if you want a real conversation, you come out to the radio shows, you come out to the community radio, you come out to the podcast, because we are not the practice people like this is CP24 and this is news at 11. No, you come to people like us when you want that real conversation. And if you're real, present, and in the moment, they're more likely to give you a better answer, I think.
Yeah, that's kind of the challenge for me is, and the higher you go in government, the more you're trying to bump people off their talking points. When I'm doing live stuff, and granted, 'cause a lot of the people I interview are professional activists or politicians, they're not going to be dropping F-bombs on live radio. I said professional. We kid. No, if you're a city council, you're probably not going to have a potty mouth in your public profile. So, the challenge there is always, because, politicians obviously have an agenda. They're there to promote policy. They're there to promote a point of view. They're there to promote government action, if they're part of a caucus. So chances are, again, the higher levels of government go, they've been briefed, they've been prepared, they've been told what they need to hit in terms of talking points. So then the challenge is, how do you knock them off their talking points? And that makes the difference between a good interview and just sort of like a plain vanilla interview. So I guess the answer is, I'm not worried about swears so much as I'm worried about getting something genuine.
The only thing I'm really going to add to that is I'm typically the one who has to worry about going off the rails when it comes to a live show. So I typically do live interviews with Mandy, my co-conspirator at OPERG and colleague. So she's actually the one who like keeps me on track, and we kind of like help each other out when it comes to interviewing either each other. Typically we do it for like move-in day at CFRU Radio. Or if we have a guest who does decide to go live. So yeah, it's just a lot of fun being able to kind of like work with other people around that. Yeah, eye contact, a little bit of Jedi mind tricks if you want to kind of help keep people on track. But yeah, for me, sometimes I get a little too comfortable and I'm like, ooh, right, I shouldn't have sworn right then and there, my bad. But yeah, that happens so few and far between. So I do still do a lot more Zoom interviews.
Nice.
For Tristan and Jenny, who do your interviews pre-recorded, what do you guys take into consideration when you're editing? Like, do you edit for like audio, brevity, etc.?
For us, the editing just comes down to tightening up the whole sound, taking out the ums and uhs when possible, dead space, tighten all that up. I don't really like to take out too much of the conversation. I do think with podcasts, it's a bit different than radio. And that's, we have other hosts that have different opinions on this, depending on who the guest is. Some of our hosts are like, can we tighten this up and have a really like tighten up this whole conversation, take out that bit where they were talking about this and take out this bit over here. And some of us are like, well, no, leave the whole thing in, because podcasters usually, or listeners of podcasts, they don't want the best of a conversation. They want the whole conversation. So there's two ways to do it like that with the editing. But you've got to do your homework too for our guests, because a lot of times we're talking to people who have been on, they've done 20 interviews in the last couple of weeks. So listening to some of those, going out to check out their interests really help as well. And you do less editing and you get a better product at the end, because you can get them excited because you listened to them or read something about their personal interest. And then when you bring that up, they're like, oh, I've been answering the same questions for the last 2 weeks, and you're asking me something a bit different. So yeah. So with the editing, I try to just tighten up the dead space and the ums and ahs, and from there just have a big long form interview.
Yeah, so I guess for some context, like so I do a lot of live interviewing, but the main reason that I pre-record is I like to extend to guests, again, because I'm talking to people that might have reasons to be nervous or not sure if they want to engage. So I always say right out of the gates that, like, before I hit record, if there's anything you don't want to share, like if there's any topics that may not occur to me that might be sensitive, you can let me know that before we hit record. But at any point, if I ask you something and you're not comfortable answering, we can move on to something else and I'll edit it like I didn't even ask. And so it's like a courtesy thing to give them that kind of comfort going in, that like, okay, like this person's really going to make space and not like push me past what I'm comfortable with. And I even say, like, even after we're done, you can still say you would prefer if any of it up to the entirety of it doesn't go on radio. So it's also totally fine if you talk to me for an hour and we got to know each other and you don't want the rest of the world to hear that. And so for me, it's about building that sort of trust and having it be a safe space and really meaning it. And so when I do, I say they're like live because, like Tristan, I edit very little out. Another part of that is editing can be very time consuming, and I'm doing this on the job for CFRU. So out of respect for hours even, I kind of call it like audio janitor. Like I clean up, like if someone came to the door and we needed to pause, or like I said, if there's a question that they didn't want to answer. But generally speaking, you're hearing exactly what transpired. And so I'm talking to them for the length of time I have to air. And if they go longer, I usually make it a 2-part. So I really do feel like this might be the only time this person has this hour on the radio, and they are not necessarily someone getting these opportunities all the time. So give them that space. If I do have to edit for brevity, say it comes in just a little over, I always take it from my side. And so it's really important to me that I'm not manipulating like what they shared or editing because I thought something was more interesting or thought someone else would. So I really, where possible, try to talk to them for an hour or less and leave everything in for that comfort. But yeah, when I do them live, really all I'm worried about is somebody carrying that tension of overthinking. Like if every second they're like, if I say this, everyone might hear it. I don't want them wearing that worry. So that's really the thing, not that they're going to say something inappropriate. If it is little kids, I don't want them to share their home address. That has happened. Pre-record can take care of that. So yeah, for like younger kids, there might be safety reasons for doing it. But for older people, I really just want that space for them to not be worried about that part while we're talking.
For anyone who kind of does a mix of live and pre-recorded, does anyone have anything else to add?
Go ahead. I was just gonna add on to Jenny's approach as well. I take comfort in as much as possible. I'm also interviewing people who may not be familiar with radio or comfortable on radio all the time. So that's part of my debrief or briefing for them, is to allow them to know that this is pre-recorded. I often make jokes where I'm like, this is purely audio. You can wear your bonnet. I've worn my bonnet. Like, you don't have to look any or present in any particular way. I also like to let them know that there's space for them to think about their answers, if they like really want to formulate a response, and like editing that time and dead space away is completely within my capabilities. But if anyone has ever figured out how to manipulate sound when crowds are around, I would be ever so grateful because that is the one thing I have not figured out. So I always have to preclude like my shows with like, hey, sorry, this was in a crowd, but here's a speaker from a rally that we were just at. So that would be kind of my approach to things. But sorry, go ahead, Adam.
No, thank you. I kind of like the background noise of a crowd doing an interview in a crowd. It gives a kind of flavor to it. To what Jenny said, yeah, I think that's one of the things I like about doing a pre-record is getting a chance to do kind of a bit of a warm up, because if so, like back in the olden days pre-COVID when we were doing live interviews on open sources, it was like we do the first half of the show, we take the commercial break or the music break, and then we bring somebody in and it's like, hey, how you doing? Why don't you have a seat? We're going to talk about it, and you get maybe 2 minutes to get everyone settled. The great thing about pre-recording is that you get to like warm somebody up. Usually if you're doing something live, you spend the first few minutes like getting someone warmed up, getting them to forget that this is a kind of an interrogative, that you're trying to have a conversation, trying to get them to forget that the microphone's in front of them and that this is going out live. Or if it's being recorded for posterity even, if you can just take 10 minutes before hitting the record button and getting somebody nice and loose and warmed up, and so that you kind of get that out of the way so that the interview can just be focused on what you want to get out of the interview. That's a real benefit.
So I know some of you do your interviews live in station, but for those who do their interviews in a different space, can you just like describe the environment that you do the interviews in, and maybe like a bit about your setup and like what you got going on when you do your interviews?
For me on Twig, we've gone through like 6 different types. We typically use Discord just because we can use a recording bot, and it's just literally type in a couple of commands and it works. And then my producer Alex will go and level the audio. We used to use another service that was web-based called Zencaster, and then they changed how their pricing program works, and they suck. Unfortunately, they're the gold standard for having old people use audio. So I also have used H4s. I've used and Marantz's, which is hardware when I go out into public. I've used my iPhone. I've used software to record the call, then I can download that to the cloud and process that on my computer. In studio stuff we've done, I've only used CFRU's studios a handful of times. When I used to work for some of the radio stations down in Toronto, we would do stuff like in studio. We'd have a producer record all the stuff, and we'd kind of do it that way. My preferred though is Zoom we've used, but my preferred is actually Discord because I'm a gamer and a dork, and it just tends to work the best. But Zencaster for the longest time was the easiest way to record stuff, but unfortunately now it's got something like a $20 or $30 per month pricing thing. But it was so easy to send that to an old person. All they needed was a browser and a microphone, and it just worked. But yeah, economy.
Yeah, we use Zencaster. It didn't last very long. Riverside was another one that they pushed towards podcasters. That one didn't work all the time either. We ended up just using Zoom, and we didn't want to use Zoom at the beginning, but it turns out that it kind of just works every time. You do only get one audio track, so if your audio tracks, if there's some levels that are wrong, there's a little bit more to do when you're editing, but never a huge problem. And then for our hosts, everyone's got a pretty decent microphone. Most people just have a USB. I prefer to have the XLR going into an interface instead of just into the computer. You get a little bit better control and audio quality. And then you kind of have to hope that your interviewee is using a decent microphone. Every once in a while, they have nothing, and then they got that tinny room sound, which isn't horrible for podcasts because interviewees are usually, the audience kind of forgives that. But when we send them the email the week or so before the actual interview, we say, you know, if you have a headset and a quality microphone, please use this, along with all the questions we're going to ask them. So we try to make sure everyone's prepared. But yeah, that's about it for us.
Sure, I can answer too. So for me, I typically use my work laptop and we use Zoom. Zoom has been so great because it's a pretty common platform that everybody knows how to use, at least those who I've interviewed. And if not, I just like lead them through the instructions. For editing, I use Audacity. It's a free program and there's plenty of tutorials on how to edit and make sure that you are coming out with quality product. And for sound, I rely on my handy dandy Blue Yeti. I love that thing so very much. I actually went to a CFRU podcasting workshop years ago, and that was one of the equipment that was recommended. So at the time, I had an Amazon Prime like account, and I decided to order it right then and there. So shout out to you guys.
Yeah, I'll take a crack. Yeah, I use Zoom, and I think it's because of that commonality. Everyone knows how to use it. It's practically its own verb. It's just easy. It's just wicked easy. You email somebody the link, and you set the time, and away you go. I've generally found, yeah, even the like earpods, like even the ones that with the wire, that helps a big deal as opposed to just doing sort of like talking over the laptop microphone. And yeah, I mean, other than that, I have a podcasting setup at my desk. Because I live in a tiny basement apartment, I have sort of this 2-desk setup back to back, and I have the microphone attached to one on an arm, so I can pull the arm in to do the interview, and then pull up so I can do all my other work. But yeah, it's a pretty simple setup, but I think the simplicity helps facilitate more opportunities. I think the tech, especially for people we talk to who don't necessarily live in this media space, if you start to talk about XLR cables, you might freak them out. So sometimes simple is best.
Yeah, I use Zoom if it is a virtual interview. There actually is a function on Zoom where you can have it set that each voice gets its own file. And so I have that set up so that if I do need to do some extra kind of like EQing or cleanup of another source that's not ideal, I can kind of do some editing on that as a standalone without affecting my own voice in that. So I find Zoom really great because of that breakout feature, but also for the commonality. At the retirement centers, I usually just bring the tiniest little handheld recorder. And then when I'm with younger folks, I tend to bring equipment that looks like recording equipment. And I find that the younger folks are more excited to engage with me when it looks like a recording studio. So the thing we're using for this session tonight, the Rodecaster over there, is what I bring when I go to schools, because it has like different like bright colors and buttons and sliders, and they all have their own microphone, so they feel very professional and very focused when they have a microphone in front of their face, and even going as far as to like, you know, focus on where their face is in relation to the microphone. Whereas with the residents, the seniors, I find if I can set a little recorder between us, they can forget it even exists. And so for them, we're having like a cup of tea and we're chatting. So the tech actually has a role in the kind of atmosphere I'm trying to collect. And to Tristan's point about quality, I think listeners are really forgiving. Like, we used to have all of our interesting remote interviews happen by phone, and they sounded so bad. And there were like years of even CBC interviews having that quality. And if you're excited about the content, you tune it out. Like, you stop for, you like catching that. But I do recommend, if you end up with a bad sound, if you re-record like at least intros or some spots in between. Sometimes I'll go into CFRU studio to make a really clean intro so that my handheld recorder that was maybe sitting too close to the resident's fan is a little bit more forgiving, because they have like breaks from that weird sound in the background. So that's a trick too sometimes, if I don't love the quality, is to just add some clean parts in between to kind of give the listener a break.
For the next question, I want to start with Amara and Sophia because it's been a while since we've heard from you. I want to get into interview prep. So do you guys do any like research before your interview? Do you guys have questions pre-written or do you just kind of wing it?
You gonna go first or me to go first?
I'll go first. Okay. So in particular, this past summer when we had our North by Northeast showcase, where we had how many artists was it?
I was not there.
It was several artists. Ricky's here. How many was it? It was a bunch, and they were artists that I wasn't necessarily familiar with beforehand. So for me, I felt like I had to do my due diligence and do my homework on these guys before they came in. So that's what I did as prep for that week, was read all their artist bios, listen to their most popular songs, kind of get a feel for who they were in their media presence. And from that, I was able to formulate some questions that I wanted to use to direct the interviews. But on the regular, we like to take it like on a case by case basis and kind of just rock out with the bands as they come in and do a vibe check when they come in initially and roll with whatever they give us. Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I would definitely second that. I wasn't there for the North by Northeast showcase, and you sound a lot more professional than me in that regard. I don't like. I feel honestly guilty every time every time somebody comes in for an interview because I'm like, man, I didn't do anything for this, and but again, like my goal in interviews is not to like, I don't need to like dig really deeply into who you are or like what you're doing. Like, I just want to have a conversation with you, and like you will show us who you are in one way or another. And so yeah, so normally like people will come in and yeah, we're chatting with them beforehand, and so that kind of gives me an idea of like, okay, are they a little bit more high energy, like can we get to like the absurd side of things on this interview, or like, you know, maybe they are a little bit more straightforward and they're not in the mood to joke or something, and it's like, okay, I can talk about something that's, you know, not something crazy hypothetical like having a third arm. And I also tend to, because the way that our show is set up, the artist will play a couple songs during which time I am doing nothing, and then and then we do the interview, and then they play more. So like we have this like really chaotic moment where the setup is happening, and I feel like I need to stay out of the way because all of the sound check and tech people are like running around like headless chickens, and I can't help. And then the interview, and then like the performance starts, and then I'm like, oh right, and I take out my notebook, and maybe at that point like I'll look at some artist bios, but like even just then, like from the other side of the glass, like I get a good sense of what their music is and what I might be able to ask them. And I think that's like one of the best places to get your information from somebody, right? It's like live. They are doing it live, like literally directly in front of me. But I can't say, unfortunately. I really hope this doesn't come back to like bite me in the butt at some point. Like one day somebody will be like, "Oh, okay, so you want to do interviews professionally with us, and you do this," and I don't look into anybody beforehand. But I still enjoy doing it, and I still try to do it on the fly. So. That's my long-winded answer. That was basically what you just said.
We kind of take it as it goes, and we'll see where the conversation goes depending on how that vibe is with the guest. But definitely a week before, we're sending them an email with example questions, and we're saying that this is a guideline also, and wherever it goes, we'll take it there. A lot of radio show and podcasts are like that now, right? Where it can go anywhere, and most listeners are happy to go wherever it goes. So there's typical questions like what got you into writing or what got you into filmmaking, but you can easily tell what excites a guest, and you can go down that direction, go down that road with them. And yeah, so I think for us, it's definitely a mix of being prepared, and that's so that they also feel comfortable too. Like if you send a guest 5 to 10 questions as an example, they feel like, and when they're specific to their work, they definitely feel listened to, they feel comfortable. They're like, oh, these people actually care about my work. Even if you don't ask them all those questions, it doesn't matter. That it's that email that helped them feel good. And then if the conversation goes, we had someone on actually who just started talking about My Little Pony, just to go back to that. And they have like a 15,000 My Little Ponies or something, maybe 3,000. But it was like, we didn't know this. Nice. So sometimes it goes different directions, and it ended up being a hilarious, fun conversation. But that was not really in our primer, in our email. So you never know what's going to happen. But I also do feel for what we're doing, we want to be prepared enough, and then have that guest feel like we were prepared for them.
I would just say my preparation comes mostly from experience. When I'm coaching other folks on interviewing people that they have never been interviewed, like other marginalized voices or people who aren't used to it, I really caution against, like, I'm like, there's a few safe assumptions. Like, for example, if I'm at Riverside Glen, I may literally know that it is a resident there. And so it is safe for me to say, like something about them living there to a point. But I guess my prep would be like in the moments before, maybe asking them, like, do you even want to talk about living here? Like, and so I don't give questions in advance, and I don't come in with questions in mind. I'd say like the biggest prep for me is making sure I'm not assuming really anything beyond the very safest assumptions. And even within that, kind of challenging myself to be like, is there something you might casually ask that could actually be really traumatizing for this person or really intense? And so, there's that conversation ahead of time of like any topics. I might give like wild examples. Like, just like some people just are like, don't ask me anything about my kids. Some people are like, don't ask me about my old jobs, or like, don't ask me about living here, or somebody might want to only talk about living here. So I'll give like the broadest examples of what other people may have shared to kind of give them a sense of what I mean when I say like topics they don't want to avoid or that they want to focus on. But I really, really go in, like, get prepared to get to know them for the first time as a very brand new person, like us on an even field where they really don't know a lot about me and I don't know a lot about them. So really, like, I want to say winging it, but winging it with like years of experience of being holding a lot of space and being very careful with winging it, but winging it.
I don't like winging it, but I don't like being overly prepared either. If I'm interviewing a city councilor, those are probably the interviews I'm most prepared for, because I've written about the city council meetings and I've been to the city council meetings, and then I wrote some more about the city council meetings. So I mostly, when I sit down I don't write out like full questions. Like I don't like, the James Lipton questions, like on Wednesday, September 13th, you're waiting for a bus on Spadina, when all of a sudden. I kind of just make point form notes about like what is it about this, what the issue is, and what it is about the issue that I want to get the answer to. And then those usually lead to follow-up questions. And I may have a list. I usually try to shoot for a list of 10 questions, or 10 areas that I want to hit. And then I won't go in any particular order. I'll follow the flow of conversation. But I think preparedness isn't just about writing really great questions that you're going to ask. It's about sort of having an awareness of where the conversation might go, and knowing where to see the blind alleys, where to see the hidden footpaths, ways to explore different issues, not just to get the answer you want, but to try and get different answers. And it also depends on the interview too. Sometimes you're doing an interview where you're trying to just get the 5 Ws. And sometimes you want to go beyond the 5 Ws, because in political speak, sometimes that's just not very insightful at all. And there are a lot of politicians who sometimes use the political speak to, I don't want to say hide their intent, but perhaps make their intent a little bit more murkier, or to like put one intent forward while also hiding another intent. So I guess it's a little bit of the feel, but you also, if your house is dark and the lights aren't working and you're walking around the house, you have some vague idea of where the couch is. You may hit it, but you might know you're going to hit it. And I think that's maybe the best way to talk about my interview technique is I'm trying to fumble around a dark house. I know roughly where the kitchen is. I might hit the wall instead of the doorway.
I'd say for me, some of my prep, it vastly depends on guests. If it's someone from the tabletop role-playing game industry, I'll read through the main book, or if I know what section they've written, I'll be like, okay, cool, you've written about this game design, let's talk about that. But a lot of it comes from enthusiasm. I'm looking for the enthusiasm in the interview. I've had one classic example where I bungled an interview ludicrously bad. I interviewed if any of you are familiar with the show Man Tracker, I interviewed him years back and I was so excited. This guy could not have given a crap less to talk to me. And I was trying to like find the fun and the I know, I was so disappointed because I was like, dude, you get a chance to go out there and do all these really awesome things. And I was like, hey, I figured, all right, cool. I'm going to have some fun with it. Again, to look for the third arm. And I was like, okay, if you could track anybody from history, who would you want to do? Completely dropped the ball on that. He just left me hanging like, dude, come on, give me the football here. And it's like, okay, how do I bail myself out of this deep crap that I'm in? And it was trying to, again, find the proverbial kitchen, but I was hitting the wall over and over and over again. So sometimes winging it doesn't always work, but that's why you have to be in the moment and be present because you're looking for those follow-up questions, looking for those foot paths. And I was eventually able to get us back on track, but let me tell you, that was about 10 minutes of being uncomfortable as hell. So yeah, a lot of being prepared can help, but being present in that moment, because I find with like someone, if you can find a way to make them excited to talk with you, you're going to have a more exciting conversation, because that conversation is going to be so authentic and so genuine that it's just, you're going to get responses you don't expect, and that's going to be better than anything they've gotten from your more traditional media outlets. But there are times when you're gonna step on that landmine and it's gonna suck.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so for me, I remember when I first started doing this, I was so nervous about my interviewing skills that I created like a list of like 30 something questions, did all of this research on this one person. And like when the interview came, like it felt very boring because I was like, I already know what you're gonna say. Like, you know what I mean? It was very like self-predicting, which was really sad. So I kind of like definitely loosened the reins on that. Sometimes a little too much to the point where I'm like, oh crap, I got an interview in like 30 minutes and I haven't thought of anything. But typically it's a mixture of both. So I really enjoy having a couple of questions to kind of guide the conversation. And I also let them know like some of the themes that I'd be talking about in an interview or in an email beforehand. But honestly, a lot of my questions and prep comes from just like listening to what they have to say and then like follow-up questions as well. So I really enjoy asking initial questions about like who they are and like what brings them here and like what they've got coming up. And then just like follow up again on like more of what the organization does, more of like their thoughts and feelings about a particular topic, and then just kind of see where it goes. I also like to add a little bit of fun into it because I think when people like think about political stuff or social and environmental justice, everything's like, what are your thoughts on capitalism? And just like really intense all the time. But sometimes I just really like to ask them to dream about like what kind of world they want to see and live in, and like what kind of things they would like to see going on in their communities that they've either had an opportunity to um, be part of or just like would like the opportunity to start. So I try to, I don't know, I try to get a big combination of just like what people would enjoy, also being enthusiastic about, I guess.
Maura, I'm going to get you to do the first answer for this one, and we'll go back down the line. So are there any special considerations that you take when you are talking to the guest before the interview? Like, do you let them know, hey, we might be talking about like some challenging subjects, or do you like let them know that like you want to make space for them to talk about the things that they're passionate about? How do you approach that?
Oh, that's a great question. So a lot of folks that I have interviewed that are related to that may have sensitive topics that they are discussing, I often do like a quick briefing and just like let them know like, hey, if this is something that's super sensitive or you don't want to talk about it, please feel free to like let me know and we can just like skip it altogether or approach it sensitively. Um, but a lot of the time, I would have to say, a lot of my interviewers know that they're about to talk about something incredibly sensitive and have already kind of done that work for themselves. Um, hmm. Sorry, could you please repeat the question for me? I just want to make sure I'm touching on all the points here.
Considerations do you take? Do you like let them know you're going to be speaking about challenging topics, or just kind of let them know that like you're here to let them speak about what they're passionate about?
Yeah, I would have to say it's more of the latter. But if there are sensitive topics, they definitely we take our time around it. Um, I don't know. I'm always pretty conscious about it. Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for that, but that's kind of my approach to it, to be honest.
I'd say for me, whenever I do my interview kind of preamble, I'll be like, okay, guys, we're going to be talking about this. I want you to have fun, but if there's anything you need me to avoid, let me know. Give me some kind of a cue, a visuals, like some kind of a signal. I can edit this out in post because when I do, because most of my interviews are pre-recorded. When I do encounter the live stuff, I always try and tell them again during the preamble if there's anything you need me to avoid. One of the things we do in the tabletop role-playing game space, whenever we do an uncomfortable situation at a gaming table, we do the X sign. So always throw up an X if there's something you need me to avoid, and I can usually adapt in the moment. But I always try and make sure my guests know this is your space. I'm merely hosting it. And we always make sure that everyone feels as comfortable as they possibly can be. Because one of the things I do on my show is I always want to foster the air of fun. I want you to feel comfortable around me like we've been friends for years. And I know not everybody can necessarily do that relationship within 5 minutes. It's kind of like the single serving friend. That's kind of what I call it when you're on an airplane and you meet with someone, right? You want to foster that really good environment where you have that single serving funness, but at the same time, if there's a barrier that's going to get crossed, they need to know they have an out with you. So it's always make sure they know first and foremost that, hey, you do you, I will work with whatever you possibly get me.
I play by a kind of formal set of rules, I guess. Um, a lot of times I reach out to somebody, city councilor or some politician, and it's like, you want to come on the show? Okay, great. What are we going to talk about? And I'll say, well, I want to hit these three rough approximate areas, and cool. And that's like kind of the ground from which we proceed. In terms of like sort of journalistic rules, if I ask you a question and you say no comment, okay, and we'll move on to the next thing. Or maybe I try a different way to ask the same question. Of course, there are rules like on background, off the record that come into play as well. That's more if you're doing like kind of like phone interviews for article writing and things like that. But you try to create a space where you want somebody to be as open as possible. And I mean, I've covered tough topics. Like I've talked to staff members at Women in Crisis, and Women in Crisis deal with nothing but tough topics. And so, when they're coming in and, we're going to be talking about issues of, sexual violence and harassment and, gender issues and things like this. And so there is an understanding sometimes just by the nature of the group you're talking to or the topic, like, a city councilor bringing a motion about intimate partner violence, those are going to be tough subjects, and you just kind of have to act accordingly and adapt in the moment.
Well, I've answered like the very in the moment ones of like, this is pre-recorded. If you share anything you don't want to share, I can edit it out. I do those like things, but I think that the bigger thing, having the person understand the context for which me me being there. So for example, if I'm at like the neighborhood group spaces, as I mentioned, like, having coffee and hanging out with people before I go into some sort of recording mode. But I found in those spaces, I had as much skepticism and kind of barriers when people thought I was being paid to talk to them as I did when they thought I was there entirely as a volunteer. In both cases, they're like, why? Like in one, they're like, oh, must be great to be paid to talk to me. Where's my money? And like this kind of like weird kind of tension of maybe exploiting them or like, me getting something more than them. But if I was there entirely as a volunteer, it wasn't trusted either. And so I found just trying to give as much context as possible as to my role at the station. So what's nice at Riverside Glen, again, like the manager can do some of that. So if I don't have the time to go and meet everybody a few times before we talk, he can give some context. But I say, like, my role at the station is trying to get voices from people that may not find their way up to the station, and and that there's lots of different barriers that might prevent people from doing that, and just giving them the context for me and like why I do it, so that they understand why I would find them interesting. Because one of the biggest barriers is I don't have anything interesting to say. Like there's like, why do you want to talk to me? I don't have a story. And it's like the fact that they've been underrepresented is the barrier. And so I have to really just break down those walls of like, no, that's exactly, like, I don't want you to speak on behalf of anybody. It's just you. It's just one more voice, one more kind of story, one more person in the community. And so the prep is really just kind of feeling out what that barrier or distrust might look like and where that might be coming from, and then trying to dismantle that in the moment, or in advance if possible by having someone they trust introduce us. And at the neighborhood group spaces, usually what happened was I looked for the most gregarious, outgoing, zany person and recruited them first. And then that person would start to sort of like get the ball rolling and get the other folks. So sometimes it took like 6 months before that shyest person at the table finally opened up. But they usually do. I usually win them over, and it's really rewarding. But it takes time. Time is the preparation in that example.
The beginning of our interviews, we just kind of give the guest heads up that we are pre-recording and can edit anything. But for the most part, we're not talking about anything too heavy on our show. We're nerds talking about science fiction and fantasy. We've had authors on before that we've brought up another author in the conversation, and then they kind of say something and move on. And you can tell, we end up finding out later that those two hate each other. And we're all mature adults. We can tell it was uncomfortable, so just move on. We don't touch on many heavy subjects to have to be apologetic about what we're saying, and for them to, if you can tell it's uncomfortable, which is very rare, you just move on like any conversation with the person in real life, really.
Yeah, I'd say we're in the same boat. We don't hit on heavy topics. I think the only times that I ever double check with people is, like Soph was saying earlier, we try to prioritize queer musicians, but like sometimes before in our interview prep, I'm like, is it okay if I reference this in the interview? Like, because that's outing people, and I never know where, you just want to make sure you know where people stand. And like, especially because I want to talk about it in relation to music or in relation to something or other. So I think that's really the only time I've ever had to bring something up prior. And then, other than that, I'm just telling people that it's conversational, and like, you talk as much as you want. It makes my job easier. Our interviews are shorter too, so we don't really our interviews are normally half an hour. Yeah. And sometimes shorter. Like, we had a 15-minute interview last week. Yeah. And so we don't really even have the opportunity to go that deep, even if that were the nature of our show.
Yeah, it's very, very conversational, off the cuff, and left to the guest discretion for the most part. We kind of just leave the ball in their court, and if they hit it back our way, we try to serve it back, but it's nothing too crazy.
Yeah, and they know it's live, and whenever I brief them, I'm always like, okay, no swearing, and like no like super like rated R topics or anything like that, but
So Mike kind of already told us a bit of a blunder with your man tracker story. So I'd love to hear a bit more about the learning curves that you guys experienced when you started interviewing, and maybe a little bit about something that didn't go so well as planned, but you got it back on track.
Man, like for all this talk we've had about talking off the cuff, and suddenly we can't think of an
yeah.
answer.
What?
Bye. I can't think of any interviews that have gone. I guess I can't think of any interviews that have like gone poorly. Like obviously there's been like just like Mike was talking about earlier. Like there've been a couple times where it's like, well, okay, now this has fizzled out, and it feels a little. It feels more awkward. I would feel like on our end than it does when you're listening.
Yeah.
I can't think of any big. Maybe. Well,
Sometimes our personalities just don't gel with the guests, and
Yeah.
they don't get our humor, and
Yeah.
or we don't get theirs, and it's just like, okay, this is gonna be like a really interview, not really
Yeah.
us bantering.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say too. Like sometimes because there are 8 of us who run this show, like sometimes I have no idea who we're bringing in, and and I don't know anything about them, and then they come in, and then yeah, it's just like you were saying, like we're not on the same rhythm.
Yeah.
And that's fine, but like those are definitely the less exciting interviews, but knock on wood, I can't think of a time that we've like really explosively
yeah.
bombed something. But again, we don't like it's 30 minutes, like nothing gets that. I guess like if there's like tech problems, like especially at the beginning, like that was kind of
that was a curveball.
that was a
just
curveball,
The
but
tech side of things, getting that in order, but
and doing that during some of the interviews is
Yeah.
it's like, well, okay, this is happening, but
how do we stall for time?
how do we stall for time? Yeah, but we've always managed to figure it out, and that's the nice part about our show is that it's so laid back.
Yeah, and we have so many team members, so if the 2 of us can't come up with something, sometimes we'll have Lucas in the room, and he's able to
Yes.
ask an outlandish question and
Yes.
kind of get the groove back going.
Shout out Lucas.
Shout out, Lucas.
For the most part, our interviews are, it seems like the guest wants to talk and they're happy to be there. We've had a couple that were just kind of boring. We had a guest on once where we did the intro and said, welcome to the show. And he just went, yes. And I was like, oh, okay. So right away it was like, okay. And then the first question came at him and he was like, and kind of just gave a simple little answer. And it was like, oh, geez. So I know I'm going to be editing a lot of dead space in here because you're taking a while. And when you're done talking, we're taking a while to be like, what do we ask next? Because this guy doesn't seem like he wants to be here. That's very rare. But even when that happens, I mean, it sucks that we're not giving the audience or the listeners great content or super interesting content, like someone who's excited to be on the show, which is most. But it's also, if the guest doesn't want to be super excited to be there, or maybe they're nervous, who knows what they're going through as well, right? So sometimes you just get, it's just like a bad episode of any TV show. It's like, yeah, that one wasn't as great. But for the most part, you kind of just keep going.
So I'll share what is probably my most common challenge, but it's not the same as my least favorite thing. So the common challenge is when memory is an issue, because a lot of the people I talk to are starting to experience some sort of dementia. Sometimes they're aware of that and they can actually share that. And sometimes that's even the focus of our conversation, which is really interesting. But I remember the first few times I interviewed people and was not aware of that. And the first moment that they shared something that in my mind, I'm like, that's impossible. So one example was like somebody telling me that her parents were on a trip to Italy. And I'm talking to this woman who herself maybe in her 80s. So it's just like, that's not likely true in this moment. I guess it's not impossible. But then as the conversation went on, there were other things where it was like, she was sort of jumping around in time a bit, but it was so lovely. And she was so happy talking about it. And I remember at the time being like, I don't need to take this story away from this woman. Like if she thinks her parents are in Italy, like what a wonderful thing to channel. So I actually find with memory, it's more like when it goes to air, I want to be authentic with their voice and what they shared with me. And so I don't want to edit that to sound different, but I don't want to seem like I'm exploiting or mocking if they've repeated a story. So, and I don't want to do the classic thing that can make people uncomfortable of like, you already told me that. So usually if a story comes up again, I just try to take it a new direction the next time. So their anecdote might be the same, but they hear me kind of take it to a new space. And I act more like it's an old story that someone shared with me or someone shared it with me somewhere else rather than reminding them that they just said that a few moments ago. So it just takes kind of careful navigation, but it's certainly something I have to really think about with editing. And I interviewed a resident with aphasia, which means that there's actual huge spaces between his words, but giving him time, he completes his sentences, and the whole focus was on his aphasia. So I shortened gaps a tiny bit here and there, but I knew that if his family was listening, they know what he sounds like. So if I just cut out all of those spaces, it would be totally inappropriate. So I had to find a balance of like, what sounds authentic to this person, but also doesn't sound like dead air, like if it's really that long. Do we need to quickly, is that affect the recording? We're still recording, okay. So that's the biggest sort of challenge for kind of could go off the rails in that sort of sense. But I go in with the attitude that it's their truth. I'm not there as like an investigative journalism person. I'm not writing a history book about this. This is like their story. And so the one person who told me that straight up, she's like, I won't be able to tell you when anything happened. She's like, I have memories. I don't know where they are. Like, I don't know where they land. So she's like, I'll tell you stories, but I can't tell you when those different things were. So with her, we came up with the metaphor of a scrapbook. It's like some residents, we sit down, we open the scrapbook at the beginning and we move through in time. Other people were jumping around to different pages. And she got really excited by that metaphor. She's like, we're jumping pages today. So, but actually the thing I find the most challenging is when people like to hear themselves talk. Sometimes it's like they may be a marginalized voice in the sense that they may now be in like a care facility. They might not get a lot of visitors. Like there could be things they're experiencing that are challenging for them. But I often find out they're like a retired school principal or like they're just like they were in a profession, even Norm Jerry. I actually found that really challenging because everything was like an answer that sounded ready-made and fully formed.
He's a professional talker.
Yeah, and professional talkers don't sound like they're having a conversation with me. So actually my least favorite circumstances are when the people have ready-made form-fitted answers and I feel like it's not actually a result of our conversation, even if the listeners sometimes like those because they recognize that person's voice. But for me, that's my least favorite situation to find myself in.
I have had that experience recently. I did a podcast with Betty Stone, who was the original organizer of the Terry Fox run in Guelph. And my first question was, how did you organize, or what inspired you to take on the challenge of organizing first ever Terry Fox run in Guelph? And a half hour later, we finished the anecdote. And things like that I don't mind because one of the goals of that is posterity. You're recording it. Because I remember preparing for that interview and like Googling like mad Betty Stone, Terry Fox run 1981, and there's just like nothing because it's pre-internet. And so part of it, putting it on, recording that and getting it on the record is posterity. So I didn't mind it going on like that. I also have issues with people who are creative with the truth, let's say, not necessarily because of physical or mental issues, but because they're blatantly being disingenuous. I covered a lot of the anti-vaccine, anti-mask protests and talked to people there. I saw my role as not necessarily like challenging them in their beliefs, but trying to understand their beliefs. And I talked to a lot of people who would say things like, well, I have the right to not wear a mask. And I would say try to get them thinking in different ways, like, well, what about your responsibility? Is there not like a responsibility to take public health precautions for the safety of everyone? And that would generate some interesting conversations. My toughest interviews, though, I think were very early in my journalistic career. One was talking to somebody who was like one-word answers. They were an activist who was promoting I can't remember what exactly. It's something to do with labor, and they were part of a collective or trying to raise awareness about this labor issue, and it was like all like one word answers, and I'm like, and I was very early in my days actually volunteering with the Ontarian. This was for, and here I am, like, I need to get a 500-word article here. And then another challenge, it was an interesting challenge. It wasn't a frustrating challenge, but another activist from South America who didn't speak English, so they had an interpreter. And so it's an interesting challenge interviewing somebody through an interpreter because you're addressing the person. So if I'm doing an interview and Taylor is the person I'm interviewing, but Odysseia is her interpreter, I have to look at Taylor and not look at Odysseia, even though it's Odysseia that's talking. And so that was something I fortunately got a little bit of counseling on before the interview. And so that was helpful, but that was an unusual experience. Again, that was also very kind of early in my journalistic career. I think experience helps smooth the waters a bit in trying to navigate some of those rougher edges.
Okay, so I've already told you the story about Man Tracker. Yeah. So I've got two. One is going to be the Taco Bell incident, and then the other one will be never interview your heroes. So the first time, this is, again, very early on in my career, and I had the wonderful opportunity to interview the first Black Power Ranger. I was incredibly excited. Walter Jones, I was ready to go. The studio was ready to go. I'm getting ready to go in. My producer at the time, Pierce and Dave, were like, okay, Mike, you're on air in 5 minutes. I got to go to the bathroom. And again, can you stall for time? And they're on the phone with Walter, like, okay, Mr. Jones, our host will be just a couple of minutes. Guys, I can't make it. Never have lived that down in 20 years. I couldn't make the interview. That is why. And that is, again, the Taco Bell incident. But that's nerves. That really, really got to me. And then I discovered never interview your heroes. There was a musician that I interviewed at PAX East. This would have been around 2011, 2010, and I was in Boston. And I was so incredibly excited to talk to this guy. I've loved this guy's music for years. I still have it on my iPhone today. So excited. I interview the guy. Dead air. Bad answers. And I'm just thinking, give me something to work with, man. And it's just the whole time. And then I ran into him the following year, and he was nice and genuine. He was very fun. But that's when I'm never interview your heroes. So when I ran into other guests, I remember interviewing, I'm gonna help me out here, a guy who played Steve the Pirate, Wash from Firefly.
Oh, Alan Tudyk.
Alan Tudyk. That guy, I was really, really, really nervous with him, but he kind of picked up on that, and we were able to work with my nervous energy, and it worked out just fine. That was back in 2014. I think he was promoting Con Man or something like that. And then I interviewed Morgan Spurlock, the guy who did the Supersize documentary, and we were talking because I wanted to avoid talking about Supersize Me because he did a Comic-Con documentary, and again, some of the questions I pulled out I wasn't getting the answers that I wanted to, and it was frustrating. Maybe I should have done a little bit more prep, or maybe it was nervous energy. I mean, you're not going to be able to play 100% of the time. And I think that's when you're doing interview prep, realize you're gonna have crappy interviews every now and again. Not everything's gonna be a Pulitzer, not everything's gonna be 60 minutes. So learning to accept mistakes, and there's a line there. It's a mistake, it's not failure. There's a very fine line, because if you beat yourself up over failure, you're going to be more nervous when you get back on microphone. It's just realizing you can pick yourself up from a mistake, you can learn from failure, but always be moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Learning from a lot of mistakes. For me, I can't think of any particular interviews where it was particularly blunderous or anything like that. I would have to say that most of the challenging ones are ones that aren't really willing to like go off of like off the cuff or like expand on answers or go beyond like what they are intended or their intentions to be there for. So like for example, just like asking about an event and then asking something further and they're like, yes, but back to that event actually, like this is what we're doing or this is like where we're going with this next direction or initiative. So like those aren't as fun, but like it's no real issue other than that. Um I would have to say for me, I have definitely had to learn to mute after I speak. I am a very emotional like person or like emotive when it comes to like listening to people. So like oftentimes in my earlier interviews, I'll be like, yeah, or like laughing like really loud or something like that. So like I've learned to just have those reactions on camera, but without the speaker. And then another one I've also really learned too is like asking simple questions and like don't make them into two and a half, three-parter questions as well because memory is fickle and sometimes like people don't always catch everything. So I just like have learned to be able to kind of guide them to the next parts of the questions that I hope to ask. So yeah. That would be where I'm at.
So to completely flip it, do you guys want to talk about your good experiences with interviews and maybe some of like the best ones that you've had? Feel free to name drop.
All right.
Do we want to start with Moro again or jump around? Or?
Oh, I knew it. Okay. That is such a good question. I've had some really great interviews over the years. Um, I think one of my favorites, which really surprised me too, I think it was with Green Shield. And then there was a lady who was talking about her telehealth experience, and it was just such an emotional um, interview to be able to talk about what was going on in her life and how she was like able to overcome it. And just I don't know, there was such an energy with that conversation. I'm trying to remember when I did it. I think it was like last year, but that was a really, really good one. And then another one I've really enjoyed as well was with Courtney Sky, Protect the Tract. So talking about Indigenous solidarity and the Haldeman Tract and like what we can do to protect it was really, really dope. Those would be my two for sure.
I'd say for me, I've had a bunch over my career, but I'll tell you one of the most memorable ones was I interviewed Sean Schemmel, who's the voice of Goku from Dragon Ball Z. He stole my microphone at Toronto Fan Expo. He's like, "Hey, I'll be back in 15 minutes." I'm like, "Where the hell are you going? Don't worry." And he ran away with my mic, gave me like 20 minutes of promos of him just screwing around, and we stayed friends for many years. But the two interviews that stick out in my mind are Allison Court, who's the original voice of Jubilee from X-Men Animated. She was also Claire Redfield in multiple Resident Evil. She was most recently in X-Men 97. We hung out on the phone, what was supposed to be a 30-minute conversation. We ended up talking for over 2 hours. We've stayed friends over many, many years. We talk on Twitter every so often. And when I found my real sister via Ancestry.com a couple years ago, she would always ask me about me and my sister, how I'm doing. When I was in the hospital for my amputation, she would always stay in touch. And then the other interview, this guy became a friend. His name is Kyle Hebert. He's the voice of Teen Gohan from Dragon Ball Z. He's also the voice of Ryu from Street Fighter, and a bunch of other anime things. And we've just become friends over the course of many, many, many years. And if I ever need an interview or promo, he's always there. And it's just nice to see people in the industry, they just become friends. And another guy that I met, he started a podcast called Welcome to Primetime, of Freddy's Nightmares podcast. He's a filmmaker named Enrique Couto. And he does another podcast called Do You Even Movie? And me and his other friend, David Denoyer, we've just become incredible friends over the course of just being content creators. I write for his other show called Weekly Spookies. And it's been a wonderful chance to collaborate with an indie filmmaker who's really taught me a lot about movies. And through his friend Dave, I've learned to appreciate cinema in an entirely new way. It's like, find something positive. For every Manos, the Hands of Fates, there is a Citizen Kane. For every Trying to think, what's another one? Ghoulies. There's something incredible like The Gate to Find. There's like incredible things out there, and it's just by through Dave and Enrique. What began as interview subjects and just listening to a podcast, they became incredible friends. So I've been incredibly blessed in this industry to meet so many amazing people.
Yeah, no, I agree. In terms of politics, sometimes it can be adversarial. I think one of the best open sources interviews was actually one of the ones very early in the show's history, which was in the 2015 federal election. Gloria Kovac, who was the conservative candidate, came into the studio and did an hour-long interview on the show. And I know that she was nervous. I know that her team was nervous. Scotty and I are not exactly God the Father Republicans, so it was, kind of hostile territory, but it was a really good time. I think she had fun. I remember a lot of laughing. I remember a lot of back and forth. I mean, wasn't necessarily a lot of agreement on policy, but I think she got a really good airing and got an opportunity to share her ideas, and we got an opportunity to push back on some of those ideas. And I think, it's always a reminder to me, and we've had so much trouble on the show convincing conservative candidates or candidates for other center-right parties to come into the studio or to join us on a Zoom and talk about their candidacy. And I always try to make this point, like, we have always had like really good times talking to conservative candidates because we do get that back and forth. In terms of my personal favorites, I got to interview Robert Englund once, who's Freddy Krueger in several Nightmare on Elm Street movies. He was a lot of fun. An instance where you can meet your heroes and not get. I was trying to be diplomatic, but I've interviewed a lot of people like around Canadian film. I remember going to Toronto Film Festival. I think it was 2009, 10. I got the chance to interview Scott Speedman and the director of a movie called Edwin Boyd, which was about a real life bank robber in Toronto in the 50s. He was kind of suffering from some PTSD, but it's kind of like an interesting story. And Scott Speedman's, of course, a semi well-known Canadian actor. I got to interview the cast of Afghan Luke, which was another Canadian movie. And I mean, it's just great when you're able to talk to like Canadian film talent because they don't always get a lot of attention because of the big Hollywood machine. Maybe one of the most memorable for me. Speaking of big Hollywood talent, I remember being like one of 20 people in a room interviewing Bradley Cooper for Hangover Part 2. You go to these sort of like round tables and everybody gets a question, and Bradley Cooper sits at the head of the table. The rest of you sit around the table asking Bradley Cooper about Hangover 2. So I like to think that I oddly enough I got the last question, so I think I hopefully got a good, thoughtful consideration about the Hangover Part 2 from Bradley Cooper.
I feel like I have way too many examples to be too specific, but my favorite moments are things like at schools. I've realized this sweet spot that when I'm not their teacher or their principal or their parent, I'm just kind of this other entity. There's like this new comfort that kind of appears, and it happens when I'm visiting residents at retirement centers too. When I'm not a staff member, I'm not a loved one, I'm not their next door neighbor, I come in and then I leave. So there's sort of permission to share differently. So most of the time, my most special moments have been when they've shared something with me and then like a loved one's listening and says to me, like, my mom's never told anyone that story. I've never heard that story. Like when there's something brand new for me in that space. But for young people, sometimes it's just them being more chill. Like I remember going and playing basketball with students over at Brant because we were doing a lot of like a lot of editing. And then like, can we just go play basketball? I was like, totally. And so we just went and played basketball together. And it was like such a sweet bonding thing. And a lot of the time, the feedback I would get in those moments is like, students are having fun with you and doing something. And there are often students that are not enjoying most of the traditional school opportunities. So it's like you gave them something positive on their report card when I was really struggling to find something that I could traditionally mark as a positive thing. So usually it's just the win of like who really needed that space and who really needed the hangout. And during the pandemic, like even though it was on Zoom, that was still happening. It was like a lifeline for me, to especially seniors, to get to hear from people who'd been through these horrific periods of history and lived through it and have some more perspective, and to still be meeting new people. That was just the biggest stuff. But one specific one is Jim Hunt. I have to do a shout out to Jim Hunt because Jim Hunt actually started CFRU. And he lived upstairs at Riverside Glen in the area of the building where people need like assistance with their bodies. And so I was on the main floor and someone's like, you got to go talk to Jim. I think he's written some stories about living in Guelph. And I went up and introduced myself, and Jim was literally like, I started CFRU. And so I know better than to trust the first thing someone says to me. You know, I'm like, oh yeah, like, let's see where this is going. And literally, like, he was a physics professor here at the university who made radio in his undergrad at Queen's University, came back as a professor, had grown up in Guelph and was like, we need radio here, and advocated for a dedicated space for a radio station for students. And Jim was like this, so many accolades, so academic, so intelligent, so wonderful and interesting. And if he had not been like in that area of the building and kind of almost like trapped in his room when I went to find him, we would never have met. Like, I feel like we wouldn't have crossed over academically. I don't have any kind of like background in schooling. So I always joke that like it took like Parkinson's to sort of like slow Jim down enough for us to intersect. And then we did so many beautiful projects together after that. And we became like such good friends. And so that was like a huge one. And it filled in a significant part of CFRU's history that none of us had heard before, including Ian McDermott, who was a student during that early era. So that was just also super valuable to the station, obviously. But yeah, that was probably the one I would highlight.
I feel so bad about our name dropping.
I know, right? You get the Emperor, I get Goku.
I'll drop some names here too. When it comes to authors, they're really fun. They want to talk, and they're such creative people. So there's been authors like Andy Weir, who is hilarious. He wrote The Martian, the book that was turned into the film, and his latest book, Project Hail Mary, is being turned into a movie, being filmed. I think they're done filming now, so that'll be out soon. But he's hilarious. Kim Stanley Robinson was really good. Martha Wells, Peter Watts, he's been on our show many times. He's hilarious and ridiculously smart. So they've been fun. My favorite interviews have not quite been interviews. We do something on the show every once in a while called Trivia from the Bridge. And that's when we bring on actors. So my favorite have definitely been like having Sean Gunn on the show. He's in like Guardians of the Galaxy and Gilmore Girls. My kids went crazy when they found out we were talking to him. And Dominic Monaghan from The Lord of the Rings and Lost, he was on the show. He was so fun. But for these trivia episodes, we don't just straight up ask them questions like an interview. We actually ask them trivia questions that are often tailored to them. So we'll bring two guests on. Sometimes it's a super fan. Sometimes if we can get another actor on, we'll go with them and ask them a question that's specific to them. So the other guest might not know the answer, but when the answer comes out, for example, with Sean Gunn, we asked him, what film was filmed in Ontario in 1995? Some question he'd have no idea the answer to. So he's like, I don't even know why you're asking me this. And we said, the answer is Shadow Builder with Michael Rooker. And because we knew he's really good friends with Michael Rooker, so he just laughed and had a great time talking about Michael Rooker for 10 minutes. So you ask them questions that are trivia questions where they may or may not know the answer, but it creates a lot of great conversation. And I think my one favorite was with someone named Joseph Marcel, which everyone probably knows. He was Jeffrey from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. that interview almost didn't happen. And I got to tell the story about this one. The interview almost didn't happen because we were set to go. He was coming on a Monday morning, or we had to be on the call because he's in London, UK. At 9 a.m., I had to be on the call with my co-host. And I wake up Monday morning. This is a year and a half ago, maybe 2.5. I can't remember the year. I think it was 2022, actually. So wake up in the morning on Monday, looking at my phone at the news. And last night, Will Smith slapped Chris Rock in the face. So I was like, oh no. What's going to happen? And sure enough, the email came in. Joseph cannot be on the show. Something came up, and it's like, well, obviously something came up. Yeah. So I just, very politely was like, okay, we'll give it some time. And a month later, reached out, and he came on, and we chat every once in a while through email now. But he was hilarious and so fun, and it was just magical having someone like him on. And he came on with another actor who's a voice actor from like Lego Star Wars video games and Final Fantasy video games. So yeah, my favorite episodes are actually not straight up interviews. They're more that trivia episode because they're way more fun. Yeah, I hope I didn't mean to drop too many names, but.
But what did he think of the slap?
We didn't ask about the slap, man. I mean, when we sent the email out, it was like, hey, we're really just interested in talking to Joseph about his career and have fun with him. Because, I mean, that would be very, I guess we'll put other people in an awkward position there, right? To have to explain for him. But we left that alone. And
I hear you.
Yeah.
That's okay. Thank you. You want to go first or me?
Yeah, sure, I'll go. My favorite interviews, I don't have like one in particular that's been like my favorite. My favorites have been the ones where the guests have been able to tell us about the impact that we've been having in the community by providing a third space for musicians to come and make music. When Judah John, who is one of the best and brightest artists to come out of Brantford in recent history, and his band came in June, we had a long discussion about third spaces being eliminated by budget cuts to arts funding and how that's done a huge harm to the community of local artists. And they said that what we are doing has been having a positive impact by making a space for local musicians to come and kind of just do their thing and have fun together. And we've been able to connect local musicians to one another, to be on bills together and just become friends. And I feel like that's been the most rewarding part for me, is being able to facilitate a community space and make something happen for the arts, because we need the arts and they are being so trashed in these recent days. But to name drop, Ben Neck and the Joints are a cool band to have on. Not a major name drop, but if you know, you know. Major to us, major in our hearts, because they were such sweeties when they came on. Just such a friendly bunch, very talented musicians. And just, we had great banter with them, I feel like. Like, Amara was talking to the drummer in Spanish. It was cool.
Oh, I forgot about it. Actually, I listened to Rockford, Illinois today by Ben Nick and the Joints. I love them. Anyways, it's similar for me as well. Some of the best interviews are just like where there's a good rhythm and we have a good time and we have a good conversation. I feel like I keep saying that, but Ace of Wands was such a lovely interview. Love Ace of Wands. And also The Last Armada was really fun. The Boo Radley project was really fun. They're just like fun people, and it's interviews like that where I'm like, okay, yes, this is why we're doing it. Like, you wouldn't know how like silly, goofy, and like funny these people.
Different side of the musicians.
Yeah, and like one of them was talking about, I don't remember what we were talking about. It was in Boo Radley, and I don't remember who even it was, but he said like when he was a kid, like his dream job was to be a door-to-door soda salesman. It's like, all right, awesome, we're running with that. Like, let's go. So yeah, stuff like that. And people who are just really funny. But also, my like favorite interview I think recently was when we had Lucas come on. So traditionally, like, well, I shouldn't say traditionally because I don't want it to be that way. But at the beginning of CFRU Live, I was mostly doing the interviews, and now we're at a point where we've been doing CFRU Live for a certain amount of time, and we want to know everybody else's roles. And so Sophia, you've been the first person to step up and start interviewing with me, and also on your own. And Katie's starting to do it, and I got Ricky kind of doing it, and also Matt came in for our interview with the Goddamsels and help me,
Duke and Goldie.
Duke and Goldie. What? Sorry.
It's a great name.
Yeah, and we were saying, well, we didn't know if we were allowed to say it on air. We were joking about calling them the gosh darnsels, but anyways, the rats and curses. Anyways, but we had this band in the other day who was just like, it was difficult for me to like establish a good rhythm or a good banter with them. And it like on a whim, Lucas, who's one of our other co-producers and who normally is like very behind the scenes, decided that he wanted to come in and interview with me, and I was like, it was you, me, and him. And I remember before the interview, he was like, man, I don't know. It was like right before, like maybe 10 minutes before we went on air, and he was like, man, I don't know. Like, he's like, I'm gonna derail this conversation. Like, I just don't know. I'm like, Lucas, it's okay. Like, I want you to come try this out, and like, it's a safe space. Like, it's a big band. They're gonna talk a lot. There's 3 of us in the room. Like, you don't have to say anything if you don't want to. And like, whatever you say, like, somebody will be able to bounce off of it because there are so many of us. And he just like took it in he does not play by the same rules that we play by. It's so like, I don't remember what it was I was saying, but I think I was talking to one of the band members about like, oh yeah, and so like, you know, this like book from your childhood was really important. And then he's like, what is the lead rhythm guitarist's favorite book from child? Like, and he just like
random questions.
just
But
random questions.
his delivery is just so funny, and it's contrasts so harshly against Amara and I's flow that I think it introduces like a fun.
He's very
like Lucas.
Yeah, he's very blunt, and he just like and that's what I mean, like playing by different, like he just did not care like even a little bit about like how anything he was saying was coming off. And it was just like, it was so perfect to have that in that moment, because again, I didn't feel like I was clicking really well with the band, and
But
he
was
just
able to
like,
bring it back.
and he just threw it, no, he didn't, he just threw it all out the window. Like he made it not
And
matter.
in a way, it was bringing it back.
And in a way it
because-
was bringing it back, but he made all of it not matter, and he made it so funny, and like it's that's been one of my favorite ones to date. And also like just having another co-producer like be able to be the person who's interviewing and like be in front of the camera is exciting too, because I don't want to hog it. Cool. End of answer.
Cool. So I have one more prepared question left, and then I think we have one on Zoom, and we can kind of wrap things up. This last one from me, super quick, putting you on the spot. You got one piece of advice to give someone who wants to start interviewing. What is it?
Listen.
Yeah. I was gonna say be yourself. Like, yeah.
Yeah, to be prepared and know your guest, I think.
I would say my advice might be, I think personally it's harder to interview people you know a lot about. So it's almost completely the opposite of what you might think. So if you're scared because you know nothing about the person, just know that you get to lean on all of the most basic getting to know yous and totally roll with it. Whereas when you know about them, you're constantly trying to dismantle like what you remember and assumptions you've made. So like, don't be scared by the unknown. Lean into the guests you don't know.
Yeah, I would second that. And I'd also say, like, don't be afraid to get started. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. There is no one perfect way to interview. There is no one perfect place to begin. We live in an interesting time. Yes, there's incredible media fragmentation, but that means there's incredible opportunity for new voices and new perspectives. If you think you don't have a valuable perspective that can be lent to, whether it's music, local music, the arts, geek culture, politics, I promise you, you're wrong. So don't let yourself get in your own way if this is something you want to pursue.
I'd say my piece of advice is be enthusiastic, be excitable about what you want to talk about, because your excitement will be infectious. And when that infection, I just realized I don't like this metaphor. That sucks. Just be happy, always be smiling, and your guest will probably smile along with you, and those will lead to very fun conversations, and in my case, some lifelong friendships.
Yeah, I'd echo everything that was already said, but definitely listen because I have a shirt on it. But yeah, definitely just get started. Honestly, I had to do this for work, but I think it's going to be a long time, like pursuing thing that I hope to do in the future, even on my own personal time. So, yeah, just get started. It's so much fun.
Cool. Awesome, thanks. We do have one Zoom question. However, I don't have my glasses on, so can someone with
yeah.
better eyesight read, please?
So, hi, I'm Lorelai. Thanks for being here today. As someone who's found myself on the other side of the mic at times, I'm wondering what sort of things make a good interviewee? What can guests on your shows do to best support your process and your content coming out the best way possible?
We can start with Amarawa for this one.
Okay. You know what? For me, I'd have to say just be willing to put up with where my mind goes. Sometimes it takes me a minute to get to where I'm going, but I will get to the couch eventually. Um, so yeah, I would say there's nothing else other than that. Just like be patient with me. We'll get there. But like come as you are. I don't believe in perfect guests or perfect interviewees. I think we're both in this together and we're gonna have a great time either way.
For me, I want you to be exciting. I want you to yeah, literally. I want you to don't act as if your publicist is in the room. I want you to be enthusiastic about what we're going to talk about. I want us to nerd out over Star Trek. I want you to think about what possibilities. I want to go in that other direction. Be willing to take that journey with me. Grab my hand and let's go together. So if you want me to be a good interviewer and you want to be a good interviewee, then let's hold hands together and let's have a friggin' blast and let's just knock this out of the park because we don't know when we're going to spend this much time together. So at least let's make a memory together.
I feel like this question's directed at me since Lorelai was literally just a guest on my podcast. I think it's important to keep in mind that an interview is a dance, sort of. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure I like this metaphor, but I mean, I have my agenda as an interviewer, and if I'm asked, if you have agreed to come on my show, you have an agenda too, and don't be afraid to push that agenda. And I mean, if I don't like the direction it's going in, I have ways as an interviewer of trying to get us back on track. But you as the interviewee have ways of making sure we stay on the point you want to make too. And it's a back and forth. Like, you see this a lot of time in interviews with more professional politicians. They have their points. Sometimes they don't necessarily answer the question because they want to answer a different question. So I know conflict is a tough word to say, but a little conflict does sometimes make a better interview. I mean, respectful conflict, of course, but it is in a way a dance too. And so a dance in which you're fighting to take the lead at any given time. But I think the metaphor holds, and I'm going to stick with it.
I would say tell your story. So don't think that you're there to represent all of a particular topic or all of a particular demographic. It's not, I don't find it helpful. And in fact, it not only gets in the way of us bonding, but it gets really challenging as a host to sort of figure out like where this intersects with the person I'm meeting and what is sort of something they think that they're giving me that they think is helpful. So talking about family members or a story they think I'm going to find more interesting, I'm not. I'm going to be more interested in hanging out with you, even if you think that that's a little boring. So it doesn't do me any favors to tell other people's stories or to overthink representation. I just want you and your voice and your authentic story. And I'd say in connection with that, if you do have a loved one who's like, a parent or something in one of these retirement facilities who gets to do interviews, for sure, show up and support your loved one, but get out of their way. Because a lot of the time, the instinct of the kids is to like take care of their parent, especially if there's sort of memory issues, or keep them on a script. So they'll do work kind of preparing their history written out. And I'm like, trust your parent to still be a human being in this space who's spontaneous and let yourself, get out of their way. And even if it's a little scary to hear your parent talk about something brand new that you've never heard, that's a really valuable moment for you and me and them. And so, yeah, the instinct to protect can be one that actually goes the other way, I think. So, yeah, I'd say just stick with you being you.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much what everyone said. Come and be present. And the more excited that you sound to be there, the more the listener's going to tune in. When guests show up, I'm sure everyone understands when guests show up and they're having fun from the start, everyone has fun the whole time. So that helps. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say, yeah, just be excited. It's kind of hard for us because we do shoot early mornings and we have bands coming in and loading in equipment at like 9:30 in the morning sometimes. But, the ones that tend to go the best are the ones where people show up with a positive attitude, who are excited to be there and excited to get to know the whole team and like show an interest in what we have going on and why they're here in the first place. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's always for me returning to that why, which is the most powerful, because like we started this because our purpose is taking a snapshot of what is going on right now at this moment, among other things, as far as like creating a community. But like having the tools and the fact that whoever you are with, you are there with them in that moment, and what you're saying and what you're thinking and experiencing is being recorded so that it can be referenced later, like inherently makes whatever you have to say valuable, and also inherently means that you don't have to take it super seriously, and that this is just a moment to be and to chat. And I think that's what makes a good interviewee, is just like I think it's like literally what everybody else has said, where it's being present, it's being enthusiastic, it's being yourself, it's not taking things too seriously, it's being positive. And even though it's easier said than done, that's the best. That's what makes the best interviewee.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today to kick off the Behind the Mic series, which is running until November 15th. So, yeah.
Thank you, Taylor, for your side of the table over there. It's here for Taylor.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to do one specific shout out specific to this table. There is a series, one of these sessions on November 13th from 7 till 9 p.m. is a focus on the CFRU Live team. So it's an interactive activity where you're going to meet some of the other team members and see the space that this happens out of. So I think they have a few different activities they have planned to get people engaging with the equipment. As you could tell from talking to these two, it's going to be really light and fun and silly, but definitely check that one out. And then on November 15th from 3 till 5? 5 till 7. 5 till 7, I'm doing the improvised interviewing workshop that I do. That's really interactive and fun and light. So yeah, shout out to those two, but you can find the whole series on our website, on our Eventbrite. But yeah, thanks for being part of this today, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
I have to run to the washroom so bad. Yeah. I'm like 9:06. It was nice to meet you.
Thanks for making this possible. I'm so glad that I was able to
Thank
join.
you.
I appreciate you being so accommodating.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm glad it worked out.
Awesome. All right. Have a good night, guys.
Thank you, guys. See you soon.
Yeah, no, it turned out well. Pass the Timbits.
Yes.